welcome one and all to this episode of the MirYam Institute webinar. And whether you're watching live or by way of one of the postcasts, or you are watching this at JBS, or you're listening via our podcast, we welcome each and every one of you. And we thank you for giving your time and your attention to a subject that very much warrants that time and attention. We've got an excellent guest for you all today. And on behalf of myself and my co-founder of the MirYam Institute, Rosita Panini, and our colleague in common, Alan Langer, we look forward to learning by way of the conversation that's about to take place. The subject at hand today, as you are aware, is the 100-day review of the Biden administration and its relationship with the State of Israel. And as was advertised, we will be speaking about Iran, the Abraham Accords, grand strategy, and the Israel-Palestinian conflict, peace negotiations, peace opportunities, and so on and so forth. In order to do so, it's my great pleasure, first of all, to introduce our guest expert. He is a publishing expert at the MirYam Institute. That is Professor Chuck Freilich. He serves as adjunct professor of political science at Columbia University, as well as Tel Aviv University. He is a former Deputy National Security Advisor in the State of Israel. And he's a longtime senior fellow at Harvard's Belfer Center and has taught political science at Harvard, NYU, and Tel Aviv University. He is the author of Zion's Dilemmas: How Israel Makes National Security Policy, Israeli National Security, A New Strategy for an Era of Change, and Israel and the Cyber Threat: How the Startup Nation Became a Global Cyber Power. He has published numerous academic articles and over 170 opinion pieces, and he appears frequently on US, Israeli, and international TV and radio stations. Professor Freilich, Chuck, if I may call you that, when is that latest book going to be published? I have a note here that it's forthcoming in 2021. Has it already been published? When will it be available?
I think it'll actually only be out towards the end of the year.
Wonderful. Well, I very much look forward to that. And I repeat, the title of that forthcoming book is Israel and the Cyber Threat: How the Startup Nation Became a Global Cyber Power. It couldn't be more timely, and it certainly looks to be fascinating. And Chuck, I hope that you'll give us the opportunity to interview you about that book once it is indeed published, hopefully live by then. I'd also like to welcome our guest interviewer for today. That gentleman is David Benger. David Benger is a research fellow at Harvard University. He is a recent graduate of Harvard Law School, where he served as the chapter president of the Louis D. Brandeis Center for Human Rights and the Law, and the event chair of the Harvard Law School Alliance for Israel, as well as an editor on the Journal of Law and Public Policy and the Harvard Law School National Security Journal. Previously, David was an investigative analyst at the New York DA's Major Economic Crimes Bureau, a judicial intern in the extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia, and a legal assistant on a trial team at the International Criminal Court. In fact, you can read David's writings on recent developments with regard to the ICC on our website at his page on the adjunct tab, and I would encourage all of you to do so. David earned a Bachelor of Arts in Politics and Russian Studies from Brandeis University and a Master of Arts in Global Affairs from Tsinghua University in Beijing, where he studied as a Schwarzman Scholar. His commentary has been published in the Boston Globe, the New York Daily News, Lawfare, Times of Israel, the MirYam Institute, and elsewhere. And I'm very much looking forward to learning from you, David, as you interact with Chuck throughout this conversation. And with all of that having been said, I leave it in your capable hands to provide us with a 100-day review of the Biden administration and its relationship with the State of Israel. Gentlemen, take it away.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Benjamin. Chuck, if I may call you so. One of the great value adds of having you as a guest today is that you have really straddled both academia and practice in your career, which lends an extraordinary perspective on the issues of the day. We have a lot of really meaty questions to dive into today, so without further ado, I'm just going to jump in. On April 29th, before a joint session of Congress, President Biden gave a long address. It was over an hour long, in fact. There was not one single mention of Israel, nor was there a mention of Palestine or the Palestinians. In fact, the only mention of the Middle East whatsoever was in the following way. He said, "We have to remain vigilant against the threats to the United States, wherever they come from. Al-Qaeda and ISIS are in Yemen, Syria, Somalia, other places in Africa, the Middle East, and beyond." That was the only mention of the Middle East at all in his speech. Now, we're here to talk about his Middle East policy over the first 100 days. There are some notable things that the administration has done, notably re-entered into the conversations around the Iran nuclear negotiations, restarted funding to the United Nations Refugee Agency for Palestinian refugees. And there are some notable things that the administration has not done. Notably, it has not undone President Trump's move of the American embassy to Jerusalem. It has not tried to undo any of the progress made by the Abraham Accords, for example. So, Professor Freilich, I want to start with a kind of a big picture question for you, which is, how would you characterize from where you sit the priorities of the Biden administration vis-a-vis the Middle East and Israel? And what can we take away so far from what we've seen?
Okay, well, first of all, before I answer your question, let me just thank Benjamin and Rosita for the invitation to be with you once again to speak at the MirYam Institute, and thank you, David, for hosting this. I think the administration's priorities are relatively clear. It's first and foremost and above all dealing with two severe domestic crises, interrelated ones, and that is, of course, the COVID crisis and the consequent economic crisis, and lots of other domestic issues. There's a very, very crowded domestic agenda. If you look at foreign policy, then I think that the Middle East is way down in the order of priorities. It's first and foremost China, and then China, and China, and then maybe there's Russia, and Mideast is way down there. By the way, that may not be such a bad thing. There's one thing that I think everybody in the Middle East could use, and that's a big portion of boredom. And if the administration doesn't believe that they have to get too involved, or they don't have to get involved in too many issues at the moment, maybe that reflects the fact that there aren't, other than the Iran issue, which I guess we'll come to in a minute, there aren't that many critical issues, or at least ones that have to be dealt with in the immediate future. I would, I should say one thing. Yes, maybe there, other than Iran, there's nothing immediate. That doesn't mean there aren't other important issues, but more importantly, there's an old Middle Eastern saying, which is that if you don't visit the Middle East will visit you. And it tends to visit in the most unpleasant way. So while I understand the administration's priorities, they should also take into account it's really hard to disengage from this region.
So let's turn then to the Iran issue that you mentioned. The Biden administration, led by Secretary Anthony Blinken, has clearly made it a priority right out of the starting gate to immediately restart discussions over the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, what was known in the Obama administration as the Iran deal. Do you think that was a good decision by the Biden administration? What do you expect? What do you consider to be a win coming out of these negotiations? And what do you think is actually a reasonable expectation coming out of these negotiations?
First of all, I don't think the choice to make the Iran issue an early priority in general and a very high foreign policy priority was actually the administration's choice. It was something that was foisted on them by Iran. Iran has spent the last 2 years ramping up its violations of the accord, its gradual disengagement from the accord. I'm saying disengagement because it didn't formally disavow it. It hasn't formally withdrawn, but it has increasingly distanced itself from it. And they especially did so in the last few months because, and they said this quite openly, they wanted to force a showdown over this. So the timing wasn't the administration's choosing. And I think if they had had their druthers, they wouldn't have gotten to this for quite a while. Now, having said that, the question is, what do we do about this? What's good? What's not good? And let me first of all say that I regret very much that the Iranian nuclear issue has become a primary focus of American domestic politics. If you're a critic of the deal, you're probably a Republican. Or if you're a supporter of the deal, you're probably a Democrat. That's really not the way this should be. The question is, what's the correct policy here? Now, like with lots of other things, there's no 100% black and white answer. There were good things about the 2015 deal. There were bad things. Overall, my belief is that it was and remains the best of the bad options for the United States and for Israel. Now, Iran has not given up its aspirations to achieve a nuclear capability, far from it. And by the way, it's worth taking into account that if we were Iranian strategists, we would probably be fully committed to the idea of achieving a military capability because Iran has got very, very, very good strategic reasons from their point of view for wanting a nuclear capability. As a matter of fact, first and foremost, fear of the United States, which they view as the only existential threat that Iran faces, and Israel's only in second or third, probably third place in terms of their order of priorities. So they're committed to it. They're not going to give it up if they have any choice whatsoever. At the height of the negotiations between 2013 and 15, when American sanctions were extraordinarily painful, it was enough to get them to the table and to make significant concessions, but not to give up the capability. President Trump then implemented a policy of maximal pressure. Again, it caused Iran extreme economic hardship. It was not enough to get them to give up the capability. Now, you can maybe make the case if Trump had been in office for another 4 years, and if there was another 4 or 8 or 12 more years of maximal pressure, maybe it would have worked. We don't know. The fact is, it didn't work to date, and we are in infinitely worse situation in terms of Iran's nuclear capabilities today, after the United States withdrew from the agreement in 2018, than we were beforehand. Iran was a good year away from enough fissile material for a first bomb before Trump withdrew. It's three or so months away today. They're closer to a bomb than they were. Now, this isn't a political issue for me. Democratic, Republican, Likud, or any of the other Israeli parties. The only question is how we most effectively prevent Iran from going nuclear. I don't think that there are very many cases in Israel's history where we achieved a period of, or had the agreement still been in effect, where we would have achieved a 10 to 15-year postponement of the threat. We didn't achieve that with any other threat that the state of Israel faced. So I would prefer a new and better deal. Iran is not going to agree to that, and I'll be happy to explain why. The real choice that we face today isn't between a false dichotomy, a straw man that I believe opponents of the agreement have created. The choice is between going back to the bad old deal or a good new deal. That's not it. The real choice is going back to the old deal with its benefits and its disadvantages, or no deal with all. And that is certainly worse for the US and for Israel.
Thank you, Professor. We actually just received a question from the audience that I'd like to put to you related to this particular issue, which is, you mentioned that there really is no better outcome, right? You believe that there is no better deal than the JCPOA that can be negotiated. If so, if that's the case, why do you think the Biden administration continues to push the line that they can negotiate a deal that has a better outcome than the one previously?
I didn't say that a deal can't be achieved. I said it's not going to be achieved now.
Okay.
Now, let me explain the thinking behind that. First of all, as I said before, Iran has got really good strategic reasons for not being willing to give up the deal, the program. I don't think they'll ever give it up completely. I think we can maybe at a later stage get them to postpone it long term. We won't get them to say, yes, we're giving it up formally, but hopefully we can create a situation in which in practice, it will be postponed and postponed and postponed again, and in reality, it won't happen. Now, we're all very anxious to see a short-term resolution of this issue, a knockout blow. Well, let me tell you, I've been working this issue for 29 years. And I think it's going to be with us for many, many, many more years. That's not the way I want it to be, quite the opposite, but let's be realistic. It's going to be with us for a long time. Now, Iran's got elections on June 19th, I think it is. Countries are hard pressed to make concessions just before elections, right? That's not the time where you want to look weak. And then it'll be a couple of months before they have the new government in office. There is a danger that if we don't do it in the next couple of weeks, and that may happen, that may not happen, then 3 months from now, it may be too late to reach a deal. It'll already have been about 6 months after Biden came into office. So it may be going back to the old deal, maybe now or never. And the assumption is that the new government is going to be even more hardline than the current one in Iran. So that'll make it harder. President Biden's approach, which is a problematical one, was I want to go back to the old deal as a basis for negotiating a new and better one. Now, I would have, if it was up to me, if I had my druthers, I would have wanted to preserve the additional leverage that President Trump achieved through the policy of maximal pressure, and use that as leverage to get the Iranians to agree to the new and better deal. But remember, any deal which is new and better from an American or an Israeli perspective is by definition worse from their point of view. And they're not going to agree to that. They've got domestic politics of their own. They're not going to agree now. From their perspective, the United States proved itself to be a totally unreliable partner. Okay, the two countries signed a deal, and the United States comes along in 2018, and with no objective justification, withdraws from the agreement. You can say it was a terrible agreement, we never should have signed it to begin with. That's a legitimate position. But in 2018, even the CIA said that Iran was in compliance with the agreement. So that the hardliners in Iran say the US, I mean, you can't trust these Americans. Why would we go and agree to a new and, from our point of view, an Iranian point of view, worst deal today? That's why I said at the moment, I don't think it's going to happen. And so that the real choice today is going back to the old deal or no deal. Maybe if we do go back to the old deal, rebuild some trust with the Iranians, not too much on either side, but a working relationship. Maybe over time, it's not going to happen immediately. Maybe we can then negotiate the better deal. And if not, what I've always thought the American approach should be was you come to the Iranians, let's say in the beginning of year 10, the agreement is supposed to be 10 to 15 years. You come to them in the beginning of year 10, which by the way is only 5 years from now. And you say to them, my dear gentlemen, this thing never expires. Now we can negotiate some of the specifics, but this thing remains in effect in perpetuity. You don't like it? We reinstate the sanction.
Thank you for that, Chuck. And we may return to the Iran question later if we have some time. There's certainly a lot to unpack there. But I'd like to move on to a different question, which is the question of the US relationship with the Palestinian Authority. It was clear that for the most part, the Trump presidency's policy was that of almost entire disengagement. The PLO mission in DC was closed when Trump was president. There was a lot of the aid programs to the Palestinian people were cut off. Since Biden came into office, he reinstated, I believe it was something like $150 million of funding to the UN agency responsible for the Palestinian refugee issue. And it seems like has made overtures to build relationships with Palestinian leadership. What do you think this means for the future of the US's relationship on the Israeli-Palestinian issue, but also generally the US relationship with the Palestinians?
I think that there is only one external existential issue that the state of Israel faces, and it's not the Iranians. As big a problem as they pose, one way or the other we'll work it out with them. Israel's a very powerful state. As a matter of fact, I'll say something that if you want to pick up and come back to, Israel can no longer be destroyed externally. The Palestinian issue is not an existential issue in the physical sense of the word. The Palestinians they're a terrorist threat, potentially. Some of them, they're not a major military threat. But the intermingling of the two populations in the West Bank, which is nearing the point of irreversibility, is, I believe, the only existential threat if you want to preserve Israel's character as both a Jewish and vibrantly democratic state. So we have to have a good relationship with the Palestinians, hopefully reach a peace.
Chuck, I'm sorry, if I could just interrupt you quickly. Can you unpack what you mean precisely by the existential threat in that sense? I think I do know what you mean, but if you could just explain what you mean about protecting Israel's character as a Jewish and democratic state.
Okay. Today, 2021, not in some distant future, if you take the combined population of the state of Israel and the West Bank, 40% of the population is not Jewish. If you added Gaza, had we not withdrawn from Gaza in 2005, there would already be a Palestinian majority. Now, the Zionist movement never defined any precise percentage of the country that must be Jewish for Israel to be the nation state of the Jewish people. Nobody was talking 60-40 or 50-50. Without the West Bank, Israel is about 78% Jewish, which I think is a number that most these Jewish Israelis feel comfortable with. And it's an overwhelming Jewish majority. The good news is that Palestinian birth rates are going down. Israeli birth rates are relatively high, certainly by Western standards. And the 60-40 ratio holds pretty much steady out to 2060, which is as far as the demographic projections go. That's the good news, but the bad news is that's not a Jewish state. I mean, that's not why I made Aliyah as a kid, not to live under those circumstances. Why not live in the United States? Or there are lots of other very nice countries in the world. Now, of course, we can say, well, we're going to maintain the current status quo forever. Palestinian Palestinians, Israeli Arabs who are full citizens. Palestinians do not vote, so there's no threat to Israel's democratic character. Well, how long can we maintain this situation? It's a military occupation. It's not fun for them. It's not fun for us. It can't last forever. So we either give them the right to vote and lose our Jewish character. We don't give them the right to vote. I don't think we necessarily lose our democratic character, but there's certainly a severe blow. I mean, there are people who are disenfranchised in the United States and Washington and Puerto Rico, but here we're talking a huge percentage of the population. Can't do that forever. So I think it is the most important challenge that we face as a state. And as I was saying before, it's just a peace agreement or progress to peace with the Palestinians isn't a favor that we're doing anybody, not to the United States, not to the Palestinians themselves. It's Israel's #1 national interest. And so if the US has a good relationship with the Palestinians, that's in our national interest. Now, having said that, I think President Trump was right to try and give the Palestinians a really strong wake-up call, a reality check. Because for decades, they've been coddled by the international community, by Europe, the last couple of decades, maybe the US themselves also. And the Palestinians have rejected just about every possibility for a peace agreement. Israel put dramatic proposals on the table on at least 3 occasions, giving them essentially 100% of their demands, other than the return of a large return of the refugees, which is not going to happen. There's wall-to-wall opposition to that in Israel. But a Palestinian state on essentially 100% of the West Bank and Gaza and a division of Jerusalem, and they said no. So I think they really need a wake-up check. I think, by the way, Israel also needs a wake-up call. I think Trump was right to finally break the decades-long stalemate about Jerusalem. I think he was also right, by the way, about the Golan Heights. But we're talking the Palestinian issue. I think he was right to do that. And I think he was right to end aid via UNRWA, the UN Refugee Agency. I'm for providing support to financial aid to Palestinian refugees, especially in Gaza. There's really severe poverty there. And let's put aside the humanitarian issue, which is important in its own right, but just from a pure Israeli self-interest in trying to maintain stability, aid is a good thing. I don't think UNRWA is the right vehicle for it. It's part of the problem. It's not really the solution. So what I thought that President Trump should have done, and I would have been happier had President Biden gone that direction, is to establish a new aid agency, which might become part of the solution, not the problem.
Thanks, Chuck. And you spoke about the wake-up call from the Trump administration. Part of that, in my view, was the challenge to this sort of long-standing accepted wisdom that has recently been attributed to John Kerry, but has really been shared by many policymakers, that at the end of the day, Israel will not make peace with its Arab neighbors until it resolves the Palestinian issue. The Abraham Accords, I would say, prove that to be false. Can you speak a little bit about what those relationships, what those peace agreements, those trade deals mean for Israel's standing in the Middle East? Does it change Israel's kind of unique nature in the Middle East? Is it helping other countries in the Middle East respect and accept Israel as a fellow Middle Eastern country? What does it mean on a more macro scale?
Well, first of all, yes, the answer is absolutely. I don't think this is something that should be attributed to Mr. Kerry. I think it was an American orthodoxy. I think it was an international orthodoxy. I think most people in the Middle East and in Israel thought that was the case, that you can only achieve a breakthrough towards regional normalization after there's a peace agreement with the Palestinians. You didn't have to be any great Middle Eastern expert to believe that. That's what all the Arab countries said. That's basically what the Arab Peace Initiative was all about. They said, first you reach a deal with the Palestinians, then we'll talk about normalization. And what's happened over time is that I think a truly historic change has taken place in how the Arab world views Israel. First of all, time has a way of changing things. And it took 7 decades in the Arab world. Not everyone, not all the Arab countries, but they've increasingly come to terms with Israel's existence and just about the legitimacy of its existence, not just the reality of it. They've also become increasingly frustrated and I would say disenchanted with the Palestinians. Now, that doesn't mean that, in essence, anyone in the Arab world has given up on their sense of identification, their moral support for the Palestinian cause. But they are tired of the endless Palestinian rejectionism, and they are tired of the conflict with Israel. And I think countries like the UAE and Bahrain came to the conclusion that they could actually better serve the cause of peace, the Palestinian cause, by normalizing relations with Israel. And then there were at least two other primary concerns of unilateral concerns of theirs. One was that what really drove this relationship between UAE, Bahrain, and Israel was the common fear of Iran. Okay, let's say that quite explicitly. It wasn't anything else. So that was number one. But secondarily, the Arab countries have come to realize that Israel is the economic powerhouse in the region with a highly advanced economy, high-tech economy by global standards, and they want to cooperate with that economy in a whole variety of areas. So they had their own independent reasons for wanting to do this.
And how have these accords rippled back onto the Israeli-Palestinian situation? It would seem over the last months or so, there has been an uptick in extremism and violence from the Palestinian side. It seems as well that President Abbas has decided to cancel the Palestinian elections with the support of the United States, with the support of Israel, because of a very real fear that Hamas may win such an election. And they may win such an election not just through fear and through intimidation, but through actual voters who want Hamas to be in power, because there's this growing anger. Where do we go from here? I mean, how do we respond to this growing Palestinian extremism and calls for violence?
Well, first of all, you're absolutely right. There's been an upturn in violence in the last few weeks. This isn't unprecedented. We have ups and downs, have had them for decades. I think it's early to conclude if this is going to be a significant upturn or a transient one. I think there's also reason to be pessimistic at the moment. I think Mr. Abbas made a major and almost inexplicable error here in calling the elections. He was certainly warned by senior Israeli officials from day one, this probably isn't the right timing from your point of view to do it. Hamas is going to win. And it took him quite some time to come to that conclusion. I guess it was hard to back down after he had made the decision. Excuse me. I don't think that there's virtually any chance for progress on the peace process for the foreseeable future. The Palestinians aren't ready for it, and we're not ready for it. People tend to forget that if you had the most left-wing government in office in Israel, willing to make the most extreme concessions, and we don't have that kind of a government, but if we did, and let's say that Mr. Abbas was ready to make the concessions that he has to make, the fact is that they are still divided between the West Bank and Gaza. The elections might have helped change that, but that's not going to happen, it seems. They're still divided. Until Gaza reunites with the West Bank, Mr. Abbas, or a successor, does not speak for the entire Palestinian people, for the Palestinian cause. Now, if you ask, what are Israel's demands for a peace agreement? Well, we want peace, we want security, et cetera, et cetera. But the bottom line agreements, or what's known in diplomatic parlance as end to conflict, I'm missing the term. What it means is when we sign the peace agreement and Israel has made all of the concessions that we have to make, that's it. The conflict is over. Now, if Hamas hasn't joined in this agreement, then Mr. Abbas can speak maybe for the West Bank, but not for them. We don't get end to conflict. Well, There's no prospects of it happening for the foreseeable future. As I said, they've turned down every agreement possible. And Israeli end to conflict, end to terms, yeah. Benjamin just posted a message to me. The incoming Israeli government, assuming that it is that it happens, that Mr. Netanyahu's tenure is almost over, is being called a coalition or a government of national unity, but it's probably going to be more government of national paralysis, certainly when it comes to the Palestinian issue.
So I do actually want to get into this question. And I want to note that we are hosting this interview live on May 6th, 2021. And so for anyone who will be listening or watching in syndication, the reality on the ground may be different a couple of days later. But for right now, can you talk a little bit about the coalition that's building and what we can expect to come out of the kind of Israeli domestic situation?
Well, the good news, if it happens, and that still remains to be seen, is that it will put an end to over 2 years of a unique Israeli cross between political paralysis and political chaos. A period in which it has been very, very hard to make decisions of importance domestically or in terms of foreign policy. And neither our Palestinian or Iranian or other regional friends, if I can call them that, sat back and waited for the state of Israel to get its house in order. Things are happening. So we need an effective government. First and foremost, we have to address Israel's economic crisis. We seem at the moment to have bested the COVID crisis in Israel, but the economic crisis is very much with us, and the COVID crisis is not yet a done deal. And there are other critical issues of synagogue and state relations in Israel, the relations between the ultra-Orthodox and community and the rest of the population. And we just saw the horror last week, the stampede, but I mean the mass deaths at Mount Meron, which I think is a dramatic manifestation of a broader problem, which is that the ultra-Orthodox, the Haredi population, is semi-autonomous already today. They do not obey laws and regulations, including those which, at least I think to most of us, seem like their absolute own self-interest. And by the year 2060, a third of Israel's Jewish population will be Haredi. Now, I said before, I think there's only one external existential threat that Israel faces. I think that the Haredi population explosion is a domestic existential threat to the state of Israel. It is untenable in terms of what it means for Israel's economy. You can't have just a few percent of the population, which is the part of the population that actually pays 90-odd% of the taxes. It's a really narrow part. They can't carry these kinds of, there are already 1 million Haredim in the country. They cannot carry them on their shoulders forever. And of course, the numbers are going to increase dramatically, maybe 3 or 4 million by 2060. It's a threat to Israeli democracy because the source of authority from their perspective is not the Knesset, it's the Rebbeinu Shalom. And I respect everyone's religious views, but first and foremost, there are the laws of the state of Israel. So that's an absolutely critical issue. If we want to stem the demographic trends underway, there is very, very little time to do it. This government isn't going to address that. It's not going to address the issue of military service by Haredim. There are a whole bunch of other critical domestic issues. As I said before, unfortunately, this government is for the most part going to be a government of domestic paralysis rather than unity. They will, I believe, their platform is going to be to try and address the economic crisis. And that, since it's not really a matter of left, right, or whatever, that hopefully they can do some effective things about. This, assuming that this really happened, it could be a changing of the guard, a generational change in leadership. And it might be the basis for the emergence of a new electoral array in Israel, in the sense of this is a coalition which is going to span pretty hard left to pretty hard right. Only Likud and the Orthodox, no, a couple of other parties, the ultra-Orthodox parties, a really extreme right-wing party. But other than that, you've got Bennett, you've got Sauer, who are pretty hard right. You've got the Meretz party, which is hard left. If they can sit together and make a go with this, that might lead to a change in Israeli politics, which I think would be entirely for the better.
Thank you. I want to sort of take a step back again and look back at the U.S. And first, a question, and I recognize this may be a little bit outside of sort of what you study, but I'd like to get your thoughts on this, which is right now, the party in power, so to speak, in the United States is the Democratic Party, House, Senate, and the presidency. There's a concern by many American Jews that there's an increase in anti-Israel sentiment in the Democratic Party. People sort of speak of two members of Congress in particular when they talk about unfair criticism of Israel, and people are worried that that's taking root, particularly among young voters. Are you concerned about growing anti-Israel sentiment from the United States and or a disintegrating relationship between the two nations? Or are you confident that the relationship will remain firm going forward?
Actually, this is a topic that I focus on a great deal. I am deeply, 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 deeply concerned about this on a variety of levels. On the one hand, if you can say it's a normative relationship between two democracies. The world's two largest Jewish communities are Israel and the United States. But there's also a national security level to it. And I believe that Israel has become an important ally for the United States. I'm talking militarily now. There's no doubt that not only is the United States Israel's #1 ally by far, I think the relationship with the United States is absolutely critical to Israel's national security. As a matter of fact, I think it's one of the most important components of Israel's national security. And so if there's a decrease in support for Israel in the US, I consider that to be a direct threat to Israeli national security. Now, what's happened in the last couple of years, it's not just a couple of congressmen, it's actually more than that. It's not just the squad, if you were thinking of them. We've actually seen 3 centrist, or at least 3 important candidates, Democratic candidates during the campaign, Ms. Warren, Mr. Buttigieg, and Mr. Sanders, for the first time speaking of making aid to Israel conditioned on a change in Israeli Palestinian/West Bank policy. Military aid to Israel was always the bedrock of the bilateral relationship. It was sacrosanct. Everybody supported it. So I find that not only a worrisome, but a horrifying development. Now, it's not as if it's going to happen anytime in the immediate future. President Biden is a lifelong friend. It wouldn't happen in any event, but he certainly won't let it happen. What we've seen, though, in the last, I don't know, about 3 years, is not a fluctuation or a mild decrease in support for Israel among the Democratic Party, but an absolute collapse in support. Now, again, for me, this isn't a partisan issue, Democrats, Republicans. Israel needs bipartisan American support. That was always the secret to the US-Israeli so-called special relationship, is that both parties could fully rally behind it. I'm happy that there's still strong support on the Republican side, but we need both sides. And since most of the Jewish community, depending on the elections, close to 80% of the American Jewish community votes Democratic, if you have a collapse on the Democratic side, you've got a, well, not quite a collapse on the Jewish side, but a decrease in support on the Jewish side, and among young American Jews in particular. So these are extraordinarily worrisome trends from my point of view. Add to it the fact that there are some tectonic changes taking place in American demography today, totally unrelated to Israel, but which will have a significant impact on how the relationship develops. I'll give you one example. The two most rapidly growing population groups in the United States, Hispanics and the religiously unidentified, well, they don't have much to do with Israel. Hispanics don't have much to do. It's not that they're anti, they just don't have much to do with Israel. And we know that there's a strong correlation between religiosity and support for Israel. So if the unidentified, religiously unidentified are growing rapidly in numbers, that's another source of potential loss in support. So I think, yeah, I am very deeply worried about this. I'm also deeply worried about the fact that we see various, in the last few years, various prominent Jewish Americans coming out with all sorts of statements about how they, this isn't the Israel that they supported, that they believe in, they're disaffected, they're alienated, and in some cases, disengaging. Now, I can share with much of the criticism, but we are now 73 years since Israel was reborn, 76 years since the end of the Holocaust. Since we are in a public setting, I won't say what I think people who take that, who allow themselves to say things like that might want to do.
Appreciate your discretion with the language there, Chuck. I share that sentiment. And I am not ashamed to say that I think of, in particular, one Jewish American, Ken Roth, who leads an organization named Human Rights Watch, which recently released a report just chock full of errors and lies, accusing Israel of the extraordinary, horrific crime of apartheid, based on nothing but conjecture. But I want to maybe step away from that for a moment and ask you a little bit more about the U.S. foreign policy. In particular, we have a great question here from the audience, which is, what is your opinion or response to Biden's policy so far towards Turkey, including but not limited to the recognition of the Armenian genocide and the Turkish presence in Syria?
That's a really good question. First, I do want to say something about the apartheid issue. I think that anybody who attributes apartheid to Israel either has very little understanding of what the term apartheid means or very little understanding of Israel, the West Bank, the reality here. Now, that doesn't mean that the situation is wonderful and that there haven't been some serious violations over the years, that Israel hasn't made some serious errors. We have. That doesn't mean that there's no discrimination and prejudice and things like that. There is. Israel's not the only country. There's a small country between Canada and Mexico, which has had its own experience with prejudice and discrimination. I don't see anybody calling the United States an apartheid state. We do not have apartheid here. We've got a problem. We really do have a problem. It's a military occupation. It's been going on for 60 odd years now. I said before, I would very much like to see it end. But attributing terms like apartheid to it are simply inflammatory. I think they get in the way of constructive discussion. They do have one very important purpose, and from Israel's critics' point of view, a very successful one, is that it undermines Israel's international standing, and it undermines support in the United States as well. I couldn't agree with you more about how you characterize the report to begin with. Turkey. First of all, I think President Biden is to be applauded for finally coming out and recognizing the Armenian genocide. The US should have done it a long time ago. Israel should have done it a long time ago. We were both deterred by Turkey's really uncompromising, harsh policy on this. It was that if anybody ever said anything about Armenian genocide, it would be the end of their relationship with Turkey. And Turkey is a very important country, the only NATO country that borders Syria, Iran, and Iraq. It's a country which Israel once had a very good relationship with and today has a very bad relationship with. None of us want to alienate Turkey and maybe lead to a conflict with Turkey. But I think this had to happen, and I would hope that Israel will follow in American steps. In terms of Turkey's role in Syria, that is one of a number of places where they're playing a negative role. They're doing so in Libya as well. They're interfering with cooperation between a half a dozen Eastern Mediterranean countries, Egypt, Israel, Cyprus, Greece, and France and Italy, a little further west, but supportive of the Eastern Mediterranean. Cooperation, which is emerging. So the UAE is supportive of it. A significant part of it is the gas finds in the Eastern Mediterranean, and Turkey is doing its best to block cooperation there, partly just because it has its own gas interests, but also simply to play the role of the spoiler. Mr. Erdogan, in his early years, was a reformist leader in Turkey, did some good things. And I think we all remember the old saying about what absolute power does to leaders. He's been there for much too long. I would hope that Turkey's citizens reach the right conclusion sooner rather than later.
And I just kind of want to follow on to that, which is in addition to Israel's relationship, or the US relationship for that matter, with Turkey, what do you think it means for Israel's ongoing relationship with its close ally, Azerbaijan?
I don't know that I would characterize Azerbaijan as a close ally. It's a country that we have a good relationship with. It was, I believe, the first Muslim country to establish full relations. We had lower level relations with Turkey from the 50s and with Azerbaijan from the 80s or the early 90s. Have a good military relationship, sell them lots of weapons, training. I presume that there's intel cooperation, things like that. And people look at Azerbaijan's geographic location and they say, well, it borders Iran. What cooperative agreements could there be between Israel and Azerbaijan in terms of Iran? Unclear. Why would the Azeris want to get in the middle of that? They've got their own problems with Iran. But it certainly doesn't hurt to have a relationship with a country that borders Iran, especially since Iran uses our bordering neighbor, Lebanon, as a basis for having provided Hezbollah with possibly 150,000 rockets, all aimed at Israel. Turkey was supportive of Azerbaijan in the recent conflict with Nagorno-Karabakh, with Armenia. Another area where Turkey, well, in this case, it probably supported American and Israeli interests, but I'm not sure that strengthens Turkey's international image.
Okay, we've done Turkey, we've done Azerbaijan. Let's throw one more country in the mix. In the aftermath of the pressure from the Abraham Accords and the way the Middle East is changing and kind of rotating with regard to its relationship to Israel, what do you foresee both the US relationship to Saudi Arabia and Israel's relationship to Saudi Arabia to look like going forward?
I think I probably have a somewhat different approach towards the Saudi issue than many Americans, certainly on the liberal side of the community, which is where I'm normally located. On the one hand, I think Saudi Arabia is probably the most heinous regime on earth. Okay, I can't think of any other country, maybe North Korea, it's a close competition, doesn't matter, which is more antithetical to everything that we believe in as people who believe in liberal democracy. And so on the one hand, I fully understand and share the desire to say, enough guys, get your house in order, change, or goodbye. But there's always the question of, well, do you live in the world you want to live in or the world that you really do live in? And it's a tough choice. And there's no 100% right answer. But the world that we live in is one of strategic interests. And the normative ones. I'm not disregarding them for a moment. I'm talking about how we balance them most effectively. Saudi Arabia is changing rapidly. The Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who will sooner or later become the king, is a man who has gained some pretty bad press in recent years, justifiably. We were all horrified by the grotesque murder of Khashoggi. We forget that he wasn't the first person murdered by the Saudi regime, or the first person cut up. They behead people regularly. If you put that aside, and you also put aside the fact that he's committed other human rights violations and he's not a Jeffersonian Democrat, he is trying to change Saudi Arabia very, very, very rapidly and dramatically. Whether it's allowing women to vote, to drive cars, and not vote yet, nobody can vote in Saudi Arabia, men or women. But drive cars. Now in the West, we say, well, whoopee-doo, okay? You know, women have been doing that for 100 years, right? Saudi Arabia, that was a big change. Allowing mixed sporting events, opening cinemas in Saudi Arabia, mixed or otherwise. They didn't have, you couldn't see a movie in Saudi Arabia. Concerts, again, you know, perish the thought, mixed. Trying to diversify the Saudi economy, wean it away from the total dependence on oil. Trying to build this new futuristic city of Niam for $500 billion. The Aramco IPO. Easing up on or reining in the religious police. The people aren't accosted on the streets anymore because the kerchief has been lowered, or men because they haven't cut their beard, trimmed it appropriately, and more and more and more. In just about every area, he has made what are by Saudi standards major reforms. So I think we all have to breathe deeply. If we push it and work with this guy, if we push him too hard, we're either going to push him away or maybe push him over, topple him. Do we really want an Iranian kind of Saudi Arabia? A country, Saudi Arabia has always been radical domestically, but do we want it to be radical externally? Does that serve the cause of regional stability, of regional peace? No way. Putting aside the fact that there is an emerging relationship between Israel and Saudi Arabia, which is a dramatic change. But even if that wasn't happening, would this serve the cause of regional peace and stability? Absolutely no way. The United States has a history of failed attempts to bring democracy to the region. It has a history of abandoning pro-American leaders at the wrong time. I think we have to work with this guy, rein in his worst impulses, try and encourage his positive impulses. I would hope that the administration will do its best to impress upon him that one of the ways that he can save the relationship with the United States is by finally coming out of the closet, so to speak, in the relationship with Israel. It's clearly there under the table, bring it above the table. That's the way. And yeah, I'm not saying we shouldn't press him for some of the kinds of reforms that we want to see on human rights, some democratization, but within reason. He can't go too far even if he wants to, and we don't want him to go too far.
Thank you, Chuck. I just have one final question for you before we close, bringing us back to the topic of the day. We've had some great discussion about Biden's first 100 days. I want to ask you to project out the next 265 days. After Biden has had one full year in office, what do you expect his legacy to be? Just 1 year out. I'm not asking for his whole presidency, but 1 year out, what do you expect his sort of footprint to have been on the Middle East? What impact do you think the U.S. will have had on Middle East relations then?
Well, I didn't know that was going to be the question, so I left my crystal ball in the other room. But, predicting anything in the Middle East 2/3 of a year out is not easy. Look, I think the Iranian issue is going to be the primary focus of Middle Eastern policy for the rest of the year. I don't think that we're going to see a great deal on the Palestinian issue. I think the administration is too hard-headed. Whether you agree with them or, not, or don't agree with them, these are people who are realists. They're not starry-eyed liberals. They're realistic ones. I think they understand that unless we have a significant change of leadership, both on the Palestinian side and the Israeli side, the chances of anything of significance happening aren't great. As a matter of fact, a lot worse than that. So I don't think they're going to go that way. I don't think we'll see a major change in policy towards Saudi Arabia, because I think the administration is thinking along the lines of what I was saying before, even though they already did come down on the Saudis significantly. I don't think they want to go much further. Maybe Turkey is an area where they will do more, partly because the recognition of the Armenian genocide already puts them in conflict with Erdogan, and there are lots of other reasons for them to want to do that. I don't think we're going to see too much on Syria, which is an issue that we didn't really talk about. Maybe on the peace process, the only area where I think they might get involved somewhat seriously is in trying to push the Abraham Accords forward, bring the Saudis into that. I think that's pretty much it. I think the agenda is a domestic one, and to the extent that foreign policy comes into play beyond Iran, it's going to be China.
Thank you so much for all of that, Chuck.
Yeah.
On that note, I would like to thank everyone in the audience for listening and for watching, and of course for your questions. We really appreciate it. We apologize that we couldn't use all of them, but the ones that we did use were really interesting and I thought really enlivened the conversation. Thank you to the MirYam Institute and to Benjamin Anthony for hosting this. And thank you especially to Chuck Freilich, who is now a professor at several prestigious institutions, formerly served as Deputy National Security Advisor in Israel. For more excellent content and cutting edge analysis on Israel and the Middle East, please go to miryaminstitute.org. Thank you again, everyone. We appreciate your time.